All right.
Welcome to the Rational Egoist, episode number 11. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Joining us today, we are lucky to have Jacob Sullum. He is a syndicated newspaper columnist and a senior editor at Reason Magazine. Thanks for being with us, Jacob.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to have you on to talk about the war on drugs because I know you've been covering this issue for quite some time. How long exactly have you been writing about it?
Well, about over 30 years, I guess, if you basically since I've been a journalist, which started in the late 80s. If you don't count college and high school, but or grade school, because
Yeah.
I started a paper in grade school, so I guess that was my first foray into journalism. But I've been working for Reason for since the late 80s. I've been writing about drug policy for them pretty regularly since then.
So when they lost the war on drugs, it was originally launched under Nixon in the 70s, but Reagan really kind of kicked it into high gear. And I'm guessing their purpose was to slow down drug use and drug traffic in the country. From that point of view, has it been anywhere near a success?
Well, I think first of all, when it started depends on how you define war on drugs. I mean, if it's based on who actually used that term, then yeah, I mean Nixon more or less did. Reagan certainly did, but this goes way back to the early 20th century when Congress first started. Well, first of all, requiring physicians' approval for certain drugs. That was a new thing. But then also cracking down on non-medical use of various drugs, starting with opioids and cocaine in 1914, right? So this is more than a century. And then you had what amounted to a federal ban on marijuana in 1937. And those were all framed as revenue measures. The idea was not that Congress was directly banning or regulating drugs, but that it was creating taxes that people had to pay. But the process for paying those taxes, which were prohibitive at the time, was so arduous that it amounted to a ban. Medical use for cocaine and opioids was still allowed and still is allowed. Marijuana not. Marijuana, there's no exception to the federal ban, even for medical use. Yeah, so this has been going on for well over a century. And the basic plan was to stop people from using these drugs for non-medical reasons, for what we might call recreational reasons. And it has not worked out so well. people are still doing that. And so the basic idea that you could prevent these drugs from being produced and distributed was clearly wrong, just in practical terms, leaving aside the morality of it. It's impossible. When you have a market, you have people who want these drugs. Inevitably, you will have people who are happy to supply them, especially because prohibition means they can earn a risk premium for supplying these drugs. So they're very highly motivated to do that. And you think about all the places where drugs can be produced, all the ways they can be transported. It's just impossible to actually stop either the importation of the drugs or domestic production and distribution. The best you can hope for as a prohibitionist is to impose costs on drug traffickers that help to raise the retail price. And then the hope is that if the retail price is higher, fewer people will use these drugs. That is not a very effective strategy either, because drugs acquire most of their market value close to the retail level. So if you try things like eradicating crops in source countries or intercepting shipments on the way to the United States, that does impose a cost, but it's not very high. It's the cost of replacing those drugs is relatively low when you're close to the source. As you get closer to the retail level, the cost of replacing the drugs rises, but the amount that you're going to seize at any given time is much smaller. So that's the basic conundrum there. And so politicians to this day still talk about either blocking the flow of drugs, as Biden does, and not to pick on Biden, although it's really worth picking on him given his whole history of enthusiastically supporting the war on drugs. But he is by no means unique in that respect. Basically, every president since drugs were first prohibited has promised that he was going to stop the flow of drugs, and that's basically impossible. And then if you look at the relationship between enforcement efforts and retail prices, arguably sometimes it has an impact, but it's not a very substantial impact, and it does not last because the black market is continuously adapting to these enforcement efforts by coming up with new ways to produce drugs, new ways to distribute them. So it's just a hopeless mission, even if you assume that it's justified to begin with. Of course, in the process of trying to do that, you create all sorts of problems. And one of the clearest ones is that you make drug use more dangerous, right? So it's more dangerous, obviously, because you can get arrested for it, but it's also more dangerous because you're dealing with criminals in order to get drugs. And you therefore may be a victim of violence. You may be cheated with no recourse. That happens a lot, right? People have no idea what they're getting when they buy black market drugs. The potency is highly variable and unpredictable. The actual content of it is unpredictable, right? So you
hold on 1 second. I want to ask you about that.
Sure.
Because I often hear in debates that I have, and people will say, well, you look how dangerous it is, especially with things like fentanyl, and they're cutting it with that, and it makes it so dangerous. From my perspective, and it might even have been something that you wrote a few years back, I'm not positive, but you said, or whoever wrote the article said, people are dying not from the drugs, but from the war on drugs. Because when you prohibit it, people are buying this stuff and you have no idea what's in it. Whereas if it were legal, when you went to buy it, the ingredients and the dosage would be right on the side. Is that an accurate interpretation?
Yes. I mean, you have to distinguish between deaths that are caused by drug use itself and deaths that are caused by the hazards that prohibition creates. So the first problem is that you don't know what you're getting. That's a fundamental problem. That comes along with any kind of prohibition regime. But then the government can always make things worse. What happens when you try to enforce prohibition is that you tend to drive traffickers, first of all, toward more potent substances like fentanyl, which are easier to smuggle because you can get many more doses into the same volume. I mean, you can get very large numbers of doses of fentanyl in little packages that come through the mail. Forget about across the border. I mean, forget about people carrying drugs across the border. That's also pretty easy to do. But even if you somehow could seal off the border with Mexico, you still have all these other routes, including shipments by mail, and it's just an impossible task to try to intercept all of those. So you encourage traffickers to deal in more potent substances, and you saw this during alcohol prohibition as well. That beer and wine were displaced by distilled spirits, and there's a reason for that. I mean, the economics of prohibition dictate that sort of outcome. So you get the situation we have now, which is fentanyl initially was introduced as a way of fortifying heroin that maybe had been diluted, stepped on, right? So it was to compensate for that dilution. But now you're making the potency even harder to predict, even more variable. And that's the basic problem. And so when the government cracks down on legally produced opioids that are prescribed for pain treatment, it succeeded in doing that in the sense that it reduced prescription. But at the same time that you see this big reduction in prescriptions, you see that the upward trend in opioid-related deaths not only continues, but accelerates. It's not a coincidence because all of these people, primarily non-medical users, although some patients as well, are now being pushed into the black market, where they're getting what is for example, ostensibly pain pills, right? These are fake pain pills that are actually fentanyl. That's super dangerous because you're moving from something that was reliably dosed. You knew what you're getting when you buy a legally produced pharmaceutical to something where you don't really know what the dose is. You don't even know what's in it. You think you're buying oxycodone or hydrocodone, but it's actually fentanyl. Or if you're buying heroin, it might be part heroin and part fentanyl, or completely replaced with fentanyl. And if you don't know that, it's obviously much riskier. It's much more likely that will result in a fatal error, especially if you're mixing that drug with other drugs, which is typically what happens in drug-related deaths. You have a mixture of drugs. But certainly adding fentanyl to that mix dramatically increases the hazards. And that's what we're seeing now. So the government responds by, cracking down on fentanyl, right? Which is, very hard to do for the reasons I mentioned. But even potentially, you're seeing a little bit of this. You encourage the substitution of fentanyl with fentanyl analogs that are even more potent, right? So the fentanyl was appealing because it's more compact, more potent, cheaper to produce, much cheaper than heroin to produce, and it can be produced less conspicuously because it doesn't require you to grow crops. Yeah, so there are obvious reasons why black market traffickers would prefer fentanyl, but that's not the natural state of things. It's not as if in a legal market everybody would be clamoring for fentanyl. For the most part, this is something that people are getting without wanting it because of the economics of prohibition.
So from my perspective, it's a clear moral case. People have a right to do with their bodies whatever the hell they want, and no government bureaucrat or anyone else has the right to tell them what to do and not do. But a lot of people make sort of a practical case that, well, if drugs are legal, so many more people are going to be using it. And then there's the theory or the idea that once you try these drugs, you're automatically addicted. Is there any truth to that? Because from what I understand, most people who experiment with drugs or maybe even use them recreationally don't become addicts.
Correct. If you look at the data on patterns of drug use, very clearly it's a small minority of people who become addicted. So, this is familiar to us with alcohol, right? This is a drug that's widely consumed. Lots of people do have trouble with alcohol. They do have alcohol problems. They hurt themselves. They hurt their families. If they're reckless, they may hurt other people as well. By driving while intoxicated, for example. But we tried, the experiment with prohibiting alcohol. It didn't work out so well. And what the practical judgment at that point was, we understand that alcohol can cause serious problems, but we recognize that prohibition also causes serious problems. And on balance, Americans decided that the costs of prohibition were not worth the benefit. There is some evidence that national alcohol prohibition had an impact on alcohol-related diseases, for example. But at the same time, it boosted organized crime. It led to widespread corruption. It caused black market violence. And there was an argument that it undermined an ethic of moderate use, right? Because everybody who wants to drink now has to go to illegal establishments, which are less conducive to moderation. Many people might have felt like, I'm breaking the law anyway, then all other rules and guidelines go by the boards, or I don't necessarily have the opportunity to do this as often as I would have if this were legal, so I'm going to take advantage of it. So it encourages excess in that sense. The practical conclusion was, this is not worth it. It wasn't. Now, there were people who said it's none of the government's business. Obviously, people who opposed prohibition from the beginning often made that argument, that it's up to me whether I want to drink or not, and as long as I behave responsibly and I don't hurt other people, it's the government shouldn't be involved. People made that argument all along, but what really tipped the balance toward repealing prohibition was that people who previously had supported it or who were ambivalent became convinced that the costs were just not worth it. And this happened over a relatively short period of time, 13 or 14 years, right? So people, adults could remember what what the U.S. was like before Prohibition. They saw what it was like during Prohibition, and so they could readily make that judgment. With drugs like marijuana or cocaine or opioids that have been banned for so long, it's much harder for people to imagine what it would be like if the government didn't try to suppress their use. And so you have to make historical arguments. You have to make arguments based on, what percentage of people who use these drugs actually end up having serious problems as a result. What kinds of costs does that impose? And how many of those costs are actually prevented, right? Because the argument for prohibition in cost-benefit terms is that you're going to prevent enough problematic use that it justifies all the costs associated with prohibition. And the thing about that argument, just first of all, from a moral point of view, it's doubly questionable, because not only are you saying that we're going to paternalistically interfere with your choices, but the government is also saying that we're going to impose costs on the people who defy prohibition by exposing them to the risks of violence, by exposing them to the dangers of the black market, by encouraging unsanitary injection procedures that spread disease. All these kinds of costs, and the threat, obviously, of arrest and prosecution, that makes life much worse for the people who don't obey prohibition. But they're not the ones who benefit, because they have not been deterred. So it's not even that we're doing it for their own good. We're doing it for the good of other people that we imagine would not only be using these drugs, but having serious drug problems as a result, but for prohibition. That's sort of the moral calculus. And it's highly questionable, right? I mean, just in cost benefit terms, how much problematic drug use is actually prevented by prohibition. There's reason to believe that the people who are most inclined to abuse drugs are the people who are least deterred by prohibition. And if that's true, you really have to question the claim that the benefits outweigh the costs.
So in 1914, it was the Harrison Narcotics Act, right? That they passed. That was the for the purpose of revenue, but that's when the drug prohibition on a federal level really began. So for the majority of the country's history, drugs were legal on a federal level. What was it like? Like, were there people dying in the streets from opium overdoses? I mean, was it a horrible situation such that it required prohibition, or was it similar to alcohol where you have bars, you have your package stores, you have some nuisance drunks on the street, but it's not really just, tearing up the fabric of society? What was the situation like back then?
Well, it wasn't just that there was no federal prohibition. Up until the early 20th century, these drugs were readily available. You didn't need a prescription. You could buy them over the counter. You could have them shipped through the mail. They were commonly included in so-called patent medicines. And yes, there were complaints that morphine, for example, could lead to addiction, that people were unknowing. And this is the way federal regulation began, was in response to concerns that people were using patent medicines and they didn't really know what was in it. And they didn't know the properties of it was in, right? So that was the initial idea, was we're at least going to tell people, we're going to require labeling, which is fine as far as it goes, so that people should know what they're buying. But to take the further step of saying, even if you're informed as to what you're buying, you're not allowed to buy it, that's where you get this very questionable use of government power. And yes, no, the government was not going to hell in a, I mean, the country was not going to hell in a handbasket as a result of drug abuse back when these drugs were essentially uncontrolled. Not to say there were no problems, but you didn't see anything like what we see now, where you have, over 100,000 drug-related deaths a year, and it seems to keep going up and up. And very clearly, that problem is compounded by the effects of prohibition in the ways that we were just discussing. So just in practical terms, any given consumer is definitely going to be better off in a legal market. and that the hazards per dose are going to be much smaller. So then the question becomes, will there be so many more doses consumed and a large enough percentage of people getting into serious trouble that the country will be destroyed? And obviously I don't think so, but you can't, you're basically making a counterfactual argument about what would have happened but without prohibition. And you can't make an ironclad argument that's going to persuade everyone. But I think there's a lot of evidence, historical evidence, current research on why and how people use drugs to indicate that it would not be the ruin of the country to let people decide, which psychoactive substances they want to consume.
Now, you said, obviously you're arguing hypotheticals. We have no real choice. But if we extrapolate from history and we extrapolate from prohibition of alcohol, from my understanding, during alcohol prohibition, you had a similar thing where the properties of the alcohol, they were being contaminated, cut with other substances, alcohol-related deaths were up. And not only that, but the murder rate was way up. The crime rate was way up because you had a war for these competitive black markets. People wanted to make money. And it's not like when you own a McDonald's and you just compete with somebody, and if they try to bump you off, you can call the cops. You can't do that when a substance is illegal.
Right.
So once prohibition ended, the murder rate, the crime rate came back down. Is there any reason to think that wouldn't happen if drugs were made legal?
I think it would certainly affect, it would reduce violence associated with the black market for sure. If you go back to the 80s and the 90s, when people talked about crack-related homicides, the implication was that people smoked crack, went crazy, and killed people. But that is not
ludicrous.
It was not what was happening. If you there was a study, for example, that looked at so-called crack-related homicides in New York City, and what they found is that the overwhelming majority were crimes related to black market disputes. Well, exactly what you were talking about, where you have a dispute in an illegal market, there's no legal, peaceful way to resolve that dispute, so people tend to resort to violence. So that accounted for nearly all of the so-called crack-related homicides. Some of them, a small percentage, were a result of crimes that people committed to support their crack habits. But almost none of them were crimes committed under the influence of crack, which is what people commonly imagined. So you definitely would see a reduction in that sort of violence. People wouldn't have as many things to fight over. And there's an argument historically that whenever during alcohol prohibition or whenever there has been increased enforcement of federal drug prohibition, you have seen a concomitant increase in deadly violence, and that this is not a coincidence. That prohibition to begin with encourages violence, and to the extent that you increase enforcement of it, that also results in more violence. When they go out, think about when they go out and arrest drug dealers, or they even successfully take down a whole organization. Well, it's not like nobody's going to step in to supply that market. People will step in and they'll compete to take over whatever the share of market that organization had. Bill Bennett, who was the former drug czar, acknowledged that you will predictably see increases in that kind of violence whenever you try to interfere with the black market by arresting dealers, arresting higher ups in the organizations, that you're disrupting a market, and that disruption comes with additional violence as people compete to replace the people who are arrested and imprisoned.
Okay. One last question here. There's different ways that you can, in my view, make this better. You can decriminalize drugs. You can treat addiction as a healthcare issue, or what I would prefer, you can legalize it altogether, and people could just buy, you want to go buy heroin, if the pharmacy or the corner store wants to sell it, you go by it. What do you think would be the most effective method that we could hope for in America? Like, what would work the best?
Well, I want to add, we shouldn't overlook the fact that in addition to all these other costs we've talked about, prohibition undermines civil liberties. And this was another thing that really bothered people during alcohol prohibition. This is the seeds of Supreme Court rulings that whittle away at Fourth Amendment, for example, go back to alcohol prohibition. When you talk about the automobile exception to the warrant requirement, that came about because the government argued that if they thought a car might be carrying booze, they didn't have the time to go get a warrant because the car would, move along and they wouldn't be able to make that arrest. And therefore the Supreme Court said, okay, we'll let the cop decide if he has probable cause for the search, which has resulted in all kinds of problems. And then since then, you've had a whole series of rulings from the Supreme Court where they have made it easier for police to enforce drug prohibition by reducing the requirements for conducting a search, and how you conduct it and when it's justified. And so when you look at these deadly drug raids, like the one that killed Breonna Taylor, you can look at that case and you say the cops did all kinds of things wrong. They did not have probable cause, for example, for the search warrant, which is supposed to be a basic requirement. It was all based on guilt by association, and there was no evidence specific to her indicating that she was actually involved in drug dealing. And in fact, they found no such evidence in the search. That was a problem. The fact that a judge signed off on that warrant was a problem. The fact that they banged on the door in the middle of the night and supposedly announced themselves, although virtually all the neighbors said there was no such announcement. And Breonna Taylor's boyfriend said he heard no such announcement. They bang on the door in the middle of the night and they burst into the house and they're mistaken for criminals. You might say they were properly identified as criminals. In moral terms, they certainly were criminals. That would be universally recognized as a felony, breaking into somebody's house in the middle of the night, were it not for the war on drugs. Her boyfriend goes and gets a gun because he's afraid who this might be. He fires one shot, and then the cops respond with this hail of bullets that kills her. So all kinds of things went wrong. There was a cop who fired from outside the apartment building. He couldn't even see what he was shooting at, obviously endangering Breonna Taylor, but also all his colleagues, his two colleagues who were inside the apartment at the time. He got fired over that, and he faced criminal charges as a result of that, right? So all kinds of things went wrong. But when you ask what is the basic cause of a situation like that, it's clearly that police have been given a license to invade people's homes in the middle of the night because they think that there might be these prohibited substances there, which is a thing that should not be treated as a crime at all. So once you say that that's a crime to possess particular psychoactive substances, you justify all of these invasions of privacy, potentially deadly police encounters, all kinds of indignities, sending people, to prison for years or decades or even life over conduct that does not violate anybody's rights, right? This is an obvious travesty. And so we would be remiss if we didn't mention all of those costs that flow.
Thank you so much for mentioning it, by the way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because I've been up until this point, I've been trying to do the sort of cost benefit analysis, but in truth, it's fundamentally unjust to try to dictate what people put into their own bodies. It's not the government's business to do that. And when the government tries to do that, you have all kinds of terrible consequences that flow from it. That's the basic problem. So the solution is to stop doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it seems straightforward to me. I don't like these approaches that are like, let's medicalize it or let's have the government sell drugs or whatever. No, this is the sort of conduct that is not inherently criminal, should not be treated as a crime. Adults should be free to produce and sell these substances to other consenting adults. And the government should not interfere with those people unless they're violating other people's rights. And now that might include, obviously it includes things like I decided to rob this guy because I needed to support my drug habit. The fact, that you're a drug user shouldn't insulate you from the consequences of that. It also would include reckless behavior. And so people driving while intoxicated pose a threat to others, right?
Yeah.
That's what should, 5-year-olds be able to buy crack? No, they shouldn't. They should not.
No.
I mean, that's a legitimate role for the government to say, these are products that are reserved for adults, so we're going to enforce that restriction. But that's basically it. That unless you are, supplying drugs to children or violating people's rights in other ways, these are not the kinds of activities that should be treated as crimes and trigger your arrest and prosecution and imprisonment.
I'm with you 100% on that. Well, we're out of time, Jacob. So is there anywhere that the viewers can find you?
Well, I'm in Dallas, but everybody shouldn't rush here to visit me. You can, reason.com. Reason.com is, by the way, I was obviously self-interested, but I will say that it is one of the great things about our site is that all of our content, including the stuff that's in the magazine, eventually goes online. And we've got archives going back decades. We've got new content that's being produced every day by my colleagues and me. Plus you eventually get all the stuff in the magazine. Now, if you're a subscriber, you get it sooner. So that's the incentive to subscribe, but there's just a tremendous amount of, I think, really interesting and perhaps more important, free content at reason.com.
Thank you very much for joining us, Jacob. And for the audience out there, we'd love to hear your comments, good or bad. Let us know what you think. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. See you next time.